Sergeant Jacob Kane was used to precise orders, unwavering loyalty, and clean exits. He had said goodbye to his unit. His bags were packed. The plane was waiting. But just as he gave his command, "Let's go, Ranger," the dog refused to budge. Then a 4-year-old girl, who hadn't said a word all morning, stepped forward and tapped the dog's collar. What happened next stopped everything. The sky above Fort Cranston was awash of soft blue, clouds drifting lazily like they had nowhere urgent to be. On the tarmac near the private runway, a black SUV idled beside a small military transport plane. The engines hummed, ready for departure. The air held the faint scent of jet fuel, dust, in anticipation. Sergeant Jacob Kane stood beside his K-9 partner, Ranger, a towering Belgian Malinois with a coat of sable and fire. Ranger's eyes scanned the airfield the way he always had, alert, unblinking, focused. He had been trained for war, for detection, for protection. And in Jacob's eyes, there wasn't a better soldier alive. "Last ride, buddy," Jacob whispered, reaching down to tighten the custom tactical vest around Ranger's chest. "After this, it's all home-cooked meals and fenced-in backyards." Ranger didn't react, not yet. He stood poised beside Jacob's boots, waiting. Still as a statue. The past week had been one long procession of closures. Decommissioning papers. Transfer protocols. An emotional send-off from the K-9 unit. Ranger, age 9, was being retired with full honors after 7 years of impeccable service. And Jacob? He was shipping off on one final tour, this time without the partner who'd been at his side since Kandahar. It was supposed to be a clean goodbye. One last hug. One last handshake. A handler's nod. But the universe had other plans. Across the airfield, a woman was trying to keep up with a small child. She was young, maybe mid-30s, in jeans, boots, and a worn cardigan that flapped in the breeze. Her daughter, maybe 4 years old, with wild auburn hair and mismatched socks, had broken free and was now making a determined march toward Jacob and Ranger. "Ellie," the woman called, jogging after her. "Ellie, wait, please." Jacob glanced toward them. Civilian family, probably one of the maintenance techs. He turned back toward the open plane ramp. The flight officer was signaling 5 minutes. He patted Ranger's side. "Let's go." Ranger didn't move. "Ranger, up," Jacob said more firmly, tapping his thigh. Still nothing. Ranger just stared forward. At something behind Jacob. Jacob turned. The little girl, Ellie, had stopped a few feet away. Her chest rose and fell as she caught her breath. She had big eyes, the kind that always looked like they were on the edge of tears, and small hands clutching something white and ragged. A stuffed polar bear. "Hi," she said softly. "Is he yours?" Jacob nodded. "His name's Ranger. He's a working dog. You probably shouldn't." Before he could finish, she stepped forward and did something no one expected. She tapped Ranger's collar. Just a single touch. Light. Soft. Barely enough to feel. But the moment her tiny fingers made contact, Ranger shuddered. Not in fear, not in discomfort, but like something had passed through him. He dropped his head slowly and let out a single, low whine. Jacob frowned. That wasn't normal. Ellie looked up at Jacob. Her voice was almost a whisper. "He knows." Jacob crouched, trying to meet her at eye level. "He knows what, sweetheart?" But Ellie didn't answer. She stepped forward again and reached out, not for Jacob, not for the bear, but for Ranger's face. The dog didn't pull away. He leaned into her small hand, eyes softening. It was the kind of gesture Jacob had only ever seen in Ranger during moments of deepest calm, like after a mission or at night under the stars. Ellie's mother finally caught up, breathless. I am so sorry, she just ran. I didn't mean for her to. Jacob waved her off. It's all right. She's fine. The mother crouched next to her daughter. Ellie, honey, we talked about staying close, remember? But Ellie didn't seem to hear her. Her attention was locked on Ranger, her hand still on his neck. Then she said it again, the sentence that chilled Jacob more than anything he'd heard in combat. He remembers the house. Jacob stared. What house? Ellie looked up at him with tear-filled eyes. The one with the girl. Jacob's mouth went dry. What girl? Ellie lowered her voice, as if telling a secret that could hurt. She's still in there. The pilot stepped from the plane and called, We're ready to go, Sergeant. Jacob didn't answer. His eyes were locked on Ellie. On the stillness of Ranger. On the words she had just said. He glanced down at his dog. Ranger, he said slowly. Heel. Ranger didn't move. He just stared in the direction Ellie was facing, toward the distant tree line past the hangar, where an old path cut between rows of birch and pine. A path Jacob hadn't noticed before. And for the first time in all their years together, Jacob saw something in Ranger's eyes he couldn't explain. Not duty. Not focus. Not obedience. Recognition. Jacob Kane didn't believe in coincidences. 7 years in the military had stripped that from him. There were patterns, variables, and decisions. Coincidences were for civilians. But standing there, watching Rangers stare into the woods like they held some invisible magnet, Jacob's structured belief system began to crack. Ellie clung to her mother's hand now, quiet again, as if her message had been delivered and her purpose fulfilled. Her earlier urgency had vanished. She simply looked tired. Jacob crouched beside Ranger, giving a short command. Stay. Ranger obeyed, but his gaze didn't shift from the trees. Jacob stood and turned toward Ellie's mother. Did you say you live around here? The woman hesitated, brushing hair from her face. Not anymore. I grew up in Cranston. Came back to help my dad after his stroke, but we're leaving again next week. Ellie's had trouble sleeping, and she gets things in her head sometimes. Jacob nodded slowly, but something in her voice made him dig deeper. The house she mentioned, any idea what she meant? Her face stiffened. We pass an old property on our morning walks. She always gets quiet when we go near it. One day she just stopped and said, She's in there. I asked who, and she said, the girl with the necklace. Then she started crying and wouldn't go near it again. A twinge tightened in Jacob's stomach. What kind of necklace? She said it had a silver star. That's all I know. Behind them, the pilot was growing impatient. Sergeant Kane. We've got to go. Jacob glanced at his watch, then at the plane, then back to Ranger. The dog still hadn't moved. Something inside Jacob snapped. He stepped toward the SUV and grabbed the handheld radio. Control, this is Sergeant Kane. I'm requesting a delay on departure. Sergeant, we're cleared for takeoff. Is there a problem? Yes, Jacob said, looking down at his dog. There's a problem. An hour later, Jacob was walking through the trees, Ranger by his side. The woman, Hannah, as she'd introduced herself, had pointed them in the direction of the house. She wasn't eager to go with them, but she gave directions. Ellie stayed silent, staring at the dog until they were out of sight. The forest was dense with birch, the undergrowth tangled and thick, as if trying to hide something. But Ranger knew where he was going. He always did. Jacob followed without question, scanning for signs of wildlife, structural collapse, or anything out of the ordinary. His instincts were sharp. Ranger's were sharper. And then, the house came into view. Nestled between twisted trunks and vines, it looked more like a memory than a structure. The roof sagged inward. The porch was swallowed by leaves and rot. Shutters hung crooked. Windows stared blankly, dirt smeared and hollow. Jacob approached cautiously. "Easy, Ranger." Ranger didn't hesitate. He marched right up the porch steps, sniffed the doorknob, then turned to Jacob. Waiting. Jacob's pulse ticked upward. He reached forward, turned the knob. Unlocked. The door creaked open, revealing darkness. Dust particles swam in a shaft of light from a hole in the roof. The air inside was stale and cold, like breath held too long. The place hadn't just been abandoned, it had been left deliberately. No furniture. No signs of a rushed departure. Just silence. Jacob entered first. Ranger followed. Floorboards groaned under their weight. The living room was stripped bare except for an old coat rack and a broken lamp in the corner. A hallway stretched forward, leading to 3 closed doors. Ranger stopped. His nose lifted, catching something invisible in the air. Then he moved left, toward the smallest door. A child's room. Jacob hesitated, then opened it. The room was small, perhaps 8 by 10, with pink wallpaper peeling in soft curls. A twin bed frame remained against one wall, and under it, something glittered faintly. Jacob knelt and reached under the bed. His fingers closed around a cold object, a small pendant on a silver chain. A star. He drew it out slowly. It matched Ellie's description exactly. Suddenly, Ranger stiffened. He turned toward the closet and growled. A low, guttural warning. Jacob was on his feet in a second, hand instinctively reaching toward his holster even though he wasn't armed. "Ranger, what is it?" The dog advanced toward the closet, one slow step at a time. Jacob followed, every nerve on edge. He gripped the door handle. The moment he opened it, a blast of cold air swept over them. The closet was empty, but it didn't feel empty. Inside, the wallpaper was different, not pink, but gray, as though a second layer had been hastily applied over something else. In the center, carved deep into the wood, was a name. Isabel. Jacob reached up and touched the carved letters. The wood felt wet. Fresh. His breath caught. A soft thump echoed from above. From the attic. Jacob turned to Ranger. Upstairs. Ranger didn't move. Instead, he turned and sat facing the closet, like a statue guarding something sacred. His ears twitched, but he didn't growl again. He just watched. Jacob heard another sound, faint, almost inaudible. A voice. Small. Fragile. Ranger. Jacob froze. The voice hadn't come from upstairs. It came from the closet. He leaned closer. His heart pounded like a drum. The air was ice against his skin. He pressed his ear against the back wall of the closet, unsure what he expected. And then he heard it again. A whisper. Clearer now. Don't go. Jacob stepped back, the pendant still in his hand. He looked at Ranger, whose gaze was still fixed on the closet door. The same closet where a child had once hidden. The same place where a silver star had been lost. Jacob didn't move. His boots were planted firmly on the warped wood floor, and yet his body felt unsteady, as if the house itself had begun to tilt around him. The whisper still echoed faintly in his ears, "Don't go." His hand tightened around the pendant. The silver star felt heavier now, like it carried more than just metal, like it carried a memory. Ranger remained absolutely still, seated at attention in front of the closet door, as if guarding something sacred. His ears flicked, but he didn't bark, didn't growl. It was as though he, too, had heard the voice, and recognized it. Jacob took a careful step back, glancing once more at the name etched into the wall, Isabel. The carving was shallow but precise, the kind made by a child who had etched her name into the house to be remembered. "Isabel," Jacob whispered. And then, something inside the closet moved. Not loud. Just a soft rustle, like fabric brushing against wood. But in the silence of the room, it was thunderous. Jacob raised his flashlight and stepped closer. He leaned toward the closet again, ready to speak. "Sergeant Kane?" A voice crackled over his radio. Jacob jumped slightly, pulling the radio to his mouth. "Yeah? This is Control. Just checking in. Your flight's been held another hour, but we've got eyes on that storm system moving in from the north. You need to be wheels up soon." Jacob looked out the narrow window. Clouds were beginning to bruise the edges of the sky. "Copy that. I'll update you shortly." He clipped the radio back to his belt and exhaled. The calm of routine was comforting, even if this wasn't routine. Ranger's gaze hadn't shifted once. Jacob turned back to the closet and dropped to a crouch. The wood beneath his knees was cold and slick with condensation, and the smell of old dust filled his lungs. He reached into the closet, brushing his hand across the back wall where the name was etched. There was nothing behind it. No trap door, no hollow. Just old wood. But the whisper. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small utility knife. Carefully, he scored the edge of the panel, searching for signs of an overlay. The blade caught, and peeled back a thin sheet of drywall. Behind it, old boards, and a small hole in the center. Jacob's pulse quickened. He slipped 2 fingers into the hole and tugged. The panel gave way with a groan, revealing a narrow crawlspace, no more than 2 feet deep, but running along the entire wall. He aimed his flashlight into the gap. And there, covered in dust, tucked against the back corner, was a blanket. A tiny, folded pink blanket. Faded and frayed around the edges. And something beneath it. Jacob reached in carefully, lifting the blanket. Beneath it lay a pair of tiny shoes, perfectly aligned as if someone had tucked them there deliberately. He reached further and found a child's drawing, a crayon-sketched image of a girl and a dog. The dog looked unmistakably like Ranger. Same eyes. Same black-tipped ears. But the date in the corner said otherwise. 1996. Jacob's breath caught. That was almost 30 years ago. "How?" he whispered. Ranger shifted suddenly. The dog rose to all fours, hackles raised. His gaze snapped to the hallway beyond the bedroom, toward the stairwell. His posture shifted from alert to defensive. Jacob stood up instantly. "What is it, boy?" But he didn't have to ask. The house creaked, not just from settling. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Someone, or something, was coming up the stairs. Jacob clicked off his flashlight. The dim light from the broken window behind him barely illuminated the hallway, casting long shadows. Ranger stepped forward and let out a low, rumbling growl. Jacob pressed his back to the wall beside the bedroom door and waited. He reached instinctively for a weapon he didn't have. His sidearm had been turned in before departure. The footsteps stopped. The air went still. Jacob peered around the frame, nothing there. But something was there. Ranger began to bark, one sharp burst that echoed through the empty house like gunfire. Jacob flinched, heart pounding, and then, silence. Nothing. No return footfalls. No movement. He flipped the flashlight back on and swept it down the hallway. Still nothing. He turned to Ranger. The dog was panting lightly, body still on edge, but the barking had ceased. Then came the sound again, but not from the hallway. It was above them. The attic. Jacob stared at the ceiling, where a small square hatch was set above the hallway, the pull cord hanging still. A faint vibration tickled his ears, like the hum of tension stretched too far. He stepped into the hallway and reached for the cord. The moment he tugged it, the hatch dropped with a thud, and a ladder unfurled, clattering to the ground. Dust rained down in a light mist. Ranger growled again. Jacob turned to him. "You staying here?" Ranger didn't move. Jacob nodded, then ascended. The attic was dark, dry, and silent. Rows of old beams stretched across the ceiling like ribs, and pale moonlight filtered through slats in the roof. The space was mostly empty, save for a single rocking chair at the far end. And sitting in that chair, half lit by the moon, was a doll. A porcelain doll in a blue dress, cracked along the cheek, one glass eye missing. Jacob stepped closer, his footsteps muffled by the dust. At the base of the chair was a faded shoebox. He knelt and opened it. Inside, another drawing. Same little girl. Same dog. But now, the girl was crying. Her face was smeared with red crayon. The dog stood between her and a dark shadow. And in the corner of the drawing, a message. He said he'd come back. But he lied. Jacob felt something shift behind him, not sound, not air. Presence. He turned quickly, heart hammering. But he was alone. Except, not really. Because now, from downstairs, he heard it again. The same voice from the closet. Only this time, clearer. And closer. "Ranger," he stayed. Jacob froze. The whisper echoed again from the lower level of the house. This time there was no static edge, no ghostly distortion. It sounded real. Present. Like someone had spoken just outside the attic hatch. "Ranger," he stayed. He turned toward the ladder. The shaft of light from the hallway below cast shadows on the attic floor, but no silhouette passed through it. No footsteps followed. Yet Jacob's instincts screamed that he wasn't alone. He looked back at the rocking chair, at the cracked porcelain doll, then at the shoebox now resting in his lap. The child's drawing inside seemed to ripple under the dim light as if it, too, was waiting for something to be said. And then something clicked. The drawing in the attic matched the one he had found beneath the closet, with one difference. In this one, the shadow was larger. And the dog wasn't just beside the girl, he was shielding her. Jacob looked again at the words scrawled across the corner. He said he'd come back. But he lied. The words hit Jacob with a force he hadn't expected. They weren't just from a child betrayed. They were from someone who had waited. Someone who never stopped. He carefully closed the box and placed it back beneath the chair. He glanced one more time at the doll before rising. The house creaked beneath him as he climbed down the ladder. Ranger stood at the hallway entrance, his posture low but focused. His tail was stiff, ears alert. The moment Jacob's boots hit the floor, Ranger turned and began walking, slowly, carefully, back toward the child's bedroom. Jacob followed. As they reached the closet, Ranger stopped again. Jacob looked down at his partner. "You heard her, didn't you?" Ranger didn't respond. He didn't have to. Jacob crouched again and examined the hidden crawlspace where he'd found the blanket, the shoes, the drawing. Everything in that tiny space had been carefully placed, not discarded. It wasn't a hiding place, it was a memorial. He pulled the small pink blanket into the light and noticed, for the first time, something embroidered into the corner. Belle. Jacob's breath caught. Isabel. Belle. His fingers tightened around the fabric. He turned back to the closet wall and looked once more at the carving of her name. He felt something stir inside him, a strange blend of sorrow and duty. The kind of emotion he hadn't felt since his first deployment. The kind that made him feel powerless. But also responsible. The radio on his belt crackled. "Sergeant Kane, storm front moving fast. We need an update." Jacob hesitated, then pressed the button. "Flights canceled." "Say again?" "I'm not leaving yet." There's something here. Something I need to see through. There was silence on the other end, then a short, clipped response. Understood. We'll report you MIA for now and update Central if we don't hear from you by 0400. Jacob clipped the radio back onto his belt and turned to Ranger. We're not done. Ranger wagged his tail once. No bark. Just acknowledgement. They moved together toward the back of the house. A narrow hallway led to what appeared to be a storage room, but the door was bolted shut with rusted iron latches. Jacob pulled on it. It groaned, resisted, then gave way. Inside was a staircase. Not to a basement, but down into something older. The walls were stone. The air was cold. There were cobwebs in the corners, and the steps descended in a tight spiral, carved from old brick and worn smooth by time. Jacob held his flashlight ahead, leading the way. Ranger walked close beside him, no longer on point. Whatever was down here, he didn't want Jacob walking into it alone. At the bottom, the staircase opened into a rounded chamber, like a root cellar, but older, with a domed ceiling and a dirt floor. And in the center, illuminated by the cone of Jacob's flashlight, a stuffed bear. White. Faded. Torn at the neck. The same bear Ellie had been holding at the airstrip. Jacob crouched slowly, setting the flashlight on the floor to free his hands. He picked up the bear, turning it gently. A small tag dangled from one ear. Property of Isabel. Return if found. His hands trembled. Behind him, Ranger whined. Not loudly, but mournfully. Then Jacob heard it again. A whisper, not cold, not angry this time. He promised, he wouldn't leave me. Jacob looked around the chamber. The stone walls were smooth in some places, rough in others. One section looked darker, wet. He walked toward it, running his hand along the stones. There was a name scratched into the wall. Barely visible. Kane. Jacob staggered back. What the? He stared at the carving, disbelief flooding his chest. Ranger barked once, sharp, echoing through the chamber. Jacob turned. In the far corner of the cellar, behind a tangle of vines and roots pushing through the wall, something moved. He reached for his flashlight, stepped forward, and parted the roots. Behind them was a small wooden chest. He pulled it free, opened it, and found military photos. Old. Black and white. Men in uniform. Dogs at their side. K9 units from another era. One photo caught his eye. A man, and a dog that looked almost exactly like Ranger. He turned the photo over. Written in faded ink. Lieutenant Harold Kane and Max, 1953. Operation Ember. Jacob's knees gave way. He sat on the cold ground, staring at the photo. His grandfather. He'd never seen this image before, never heard of a dog named Max. But the resemblance was too strong. Ranger wasn't just a military working dog. He was descended from one. And somehow, this house, this place, it had been part of that legacy. Ranger, Jacob whispered. You've been here before. The dog didn't move. He sat beside Jacob, quietly watching. And then, from behind them, the voice came once more. Clear. Soft. You came back. Jacob sat motionless, the photo trembling slightly in his hand. Lieutenant Harold Kane and Max, 1953. He couldn't pull his eyes away from the image. His grandfather, younger than Jacob had ever seen him even in family albums, stood in full uniform beside a regal-looking dog with the same proud bearing, the same pointed ears, and piercing gaze as Ranger. The resemblance wasn't just uncanny, it was almost spiritual. Ranger lowered himself beside Jacob, resting his head gently on the soldier's thigh. Jacob looked down at his partner. You're carrying more than just training, Aren't you? The silence in the cellar didn't answer. But the air around them had changed. It was no longer suffocating. No longer pressing inward. It had become reflective. He looked again at the scratched name in the wall, Kane. It was faint, but not accidental. Someone had wanted it to be found. Jacob ran his fingers over the letters. They felt newly exposed, as though the wall had been waiting for the right hands to brush away time's dust. He reached back into the box and pulled out the rest of the contents. Dog tags. A folded letter. And one more photograph. This one, older still, a little girl, holding a stuffed bear, standing in front of the house as it had once been. Vibrant. Painted. Alive. A man stood beside her, presumably her father, and a dog was curled at their feet. The girl's name, written in cursive at the bottom corner, was unmistakable. Isabel Kane. Jacob's throat tightened. He looked again at the letter, its edges worn and flaking. Carefully, he unfolded it. The handwriting was elegant, masculine. To whoever finds this. My name is Lieutenant Harold Kane. If this letter has survived, then so has the truth I couldn't make the world believe. Isabel is my daughter. My dog, Max, never left her side, even when the rest of the world did. There are things in this house that defy logic, events that turn memory into myth. But the bond between child and K9, it transcends time. They were separated. She waited. He stayed. And I failed them both. I write this in the hope that someone, a Kane, perhaps, will come back to where it began. To listen. To remember. To finish what I could not. We made a promise. She's still waiting. Jacob's eyes stung, and he didn't blink it away. You're not the only one who stayed, Grandpa, he whispered. He folded the letter with reverence and slid it into his jacket pocket. Then he stood. Come on, Ranger. The dog rose immediately, tail low but steady. Jacob turned back toward the staircase. The climb felt longer on the way up, as though the house resisted letting them go. When they finally emerged from the basement, daylight had shifted. The storm clouds had gathered fully now, bruising the sky with charcoal edges and a cold wind that rushed through the open front door. But Jacob didn't head for the exit. He turned left. Back to the child's bedroom. Back to the closet. Ranger followed. The small crawlspace was untouched. Jacob pulled out the tiny shoes again, the pink blanket, the drawing of the girl and the dog. He laid them out carefully in the center of the floor. Then he opened the pendant, the silver star, and placed it on top of the blanket. He sat cross-legged on the floor, Ranger at his side. I don't know how you're still here, Belle, he said softly. But I'm sorry you were left behind. Silence. Then, a soft gust of wind, brushing his cheek from nowhere. The smell of lavender. Faint. He looked at Ranger. The dog wasn't staring into the closet anymore. He was looking just past Jacob's shoulder. At something, or someone, Jacob couldn't see. And then, a faint rustling. A tiny creak of a board. Jacob turned. And for the briefest moment, he saw her. A girl, translucent, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. Dressed in a pale blue nightgown, holding the same white bear Jacob had found in the cellar. Her feet hovered just above the floor, but she was real enough that Jacob could feel her sadness, and her longing. She looked down at the blanket and the pendant. Her lips parted. Daddy said he'd be back. Jacob swallowed hard. I know. I think he tried. I think Ranger's the reason I'm here. He brought me to you. She looked at the dog. Ranger tilted his head. The girl smiled, softly. And then she reached out. Her hand passed just above the dog's fur, not touching, not quite real, But Ranger closed his eyes as if he felt it anyway. A sound filled the room, not a voice, not wind. Something purer. Relief. Jacob sat very still. He didn't want to spook her. He didn't want this moment to end. Belle knelt beside the blanket and picked up the pendant. Her fingers passed through it, but she didn't seem to mind. She looked at Jacob. "You kept your promise." He nodded, barely able to speak. She stood slowly, walked to the closet, and paused. "I don't want to hide anymore." "You don't have to," Jacob whispered. "You're free now." The moment he said it, the room shifted, not violently, not with terror, but with peace. The light from the hallway spilled in, and for a second, Jacob could swear the wallpaper returned to its original color. The floor seemed cleaner. The air, lighter. He looked up. Belle was gone. So was the bear. The blanket remained. Folded now. Neatly. With the pendant on top. Jacob exhaled deeply, wiping his eyes. Ranger leaned in and nudged his side. "Yeah," Jacob said. "Let's go home." Outside, the first drops of rain fell. But they felt warm. He climbed into the SUV, Ranger jumping into the passenger space like he always had. Jacob glanced once in the rearview mirror at the house. It looked less broken. Still old, still empty, but no longer haunted. The storm rolled in behind them as they drove away. But Jacob felt none of it. Not anymore. The windshield wipers scraped rhythmically against the glass, clearing a light mist that had settled as the rain began to fall in steady sheets. Jacob sat behind the wheel, his eyes trained not on the road ahead, but on the woods behind them slowly vanishing in the rearview mirror. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, tongue out, ears twitching at each patter on the roof. "Storm's chasing us," Jacob muttered. But the weight in his chest had lifted. It was strange, like leaving a funeral where something beautiful had been laid to rest. Not grief. Not regret. Just a quiet closure. They hadn't gone more than 2 miles when the radio crackled to life. "This is Control. Sergeant Kane, status update?" Jacob hesitated before answering. "Mission complete," he said plainly. There was silence on the other end. Then, "Copy that. Standing by for debrief." Jacob nodded to himself, flicked the radio off, and pulled onto the road that would lead them back toward the base. But his thoughts weren't with the army anymore. They were with the little girl in the blue nightgown, with the pendant, and with the voice that had echoed through time to reach him, a Kane, connected by blood and by bond to a promise long overdue. And to a dog who had never left her. Back on base, the sun was dipping low behind the hangars, casting long shadows across the concrete. The transport plane was gone. A new one stood waiting, but Jacob didn't approach it. Instead, he parked near the K9 unit building and stepped out with Ranger at his side. The rain had stopped but left the ground glistening, reflective like glass. Ranger's paws clicked against the sidewalk as they made their way toward the kennels. Inside, an officer looked up in surprise. "Sergeant Kane. Weren't you on the outbound list?" "I was," Jacob replied, brushing rain from his jacket. "Plans changed." The officer gave a curious look. "Paperwork says your dog was decommissioned. Retirement sealed and approved." Jacob met his gaze. "I'm rescinding that." A beat of silence. "You have the authority?" Jacob tapped the insignia on his shoulder. "I do now." That night, Jacob lay awake on the cot in his private quarters, the letter from his grandfather open in his hands again. She waited. Max stayed. "I couldn't, but maybe someone will." The weight of those words haunted him, but in a comforting way, like a voice from a dream reminding you not to forget. He placed the letter back in its envelope and reached down to scratch Ranger behind the ears. "You remembered," he whispered. Ranger blinked slowly, then let out a deep sigh and rested his head on Jacob's boot. Morning arrived with new clarity. Jacob stood before a digital whiteboard in the K9 Operations Center, surrounded by military handlers, intelligence officers, and 2 base historians. On the screen were the photos he had retrieved from the wooden box: Lieutenant Harold Kane, Max, the original drawings, and the girl. This, Jacob said, pointing to the oldest photo, was taken at a civilian safe house in 1953 during a covert operation now classified under Ember Dust. The room was quiet. I found these hidden in a sealed chamber beneath that same property. And Ranger, my current K9, is genetically linked to Max, the dog in this photograph. One of the intelligence officers raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting a service dog retained memory of a location it was never trained in? I'm suggesting, Jacob said, that some bonds, especially forged in trauma or duty, run deeper than what we can catalog. Another handler leaned forward. Are you saying the child in those drawings never left? Jacob didn't answer directly. Instead, he tapped the screen again and brought up a digital scan of the star pendant, then the girl's handwriting. The room fell silent again. Finally, Jacob added, my grandfather's final mission wasn't logged. Neither was the loss of the child. But I believe she was left behind. And that Max stayed, until he couldn't. That afternoon, a technician came into Jacob's quarters carrying a small parcel. No return address, the young man said. Dropped off at the main gate. Said it was for you. Jacob opened it. Inside was a framed drawing. Crayon. Child's hand. Ranger. And the girl. Holding hands. At the bottom, in a child's scrawl. Thank you. No name. No date. No explanation. Jacob smiled, for the first time in days, without reservation. He placed the frame on the desk. Ranger barked once, softly, as if to say you're welcome. As the days passed, Jacob and Ranger stayed at Fort Cranston. No orders came. No summons. It was as if Central Command knew something had shifted and left the pieces alone to settle. One morning, Jacob visited Ellie and her mother, Anna, who were preparing to leave town. Ellie ran to the gate when she saw them, arms wide. Ranger trotted forward, wagging hard. Anna smiled. She hasn't had a nightmare since that day. Jacob knelt. You helped us find her, Ellie. The girl looked serious. She helped me too. She said it's okay now. Jacob nodded. Yeah. It is. Ellie leaned close and whispered in Ranger's ear. Ranger licked her cheek. Will you visit us? Ellie asked. If I can, Jacob said. But Ranger's always with you. Just close your eyes and listen. Ellie grinned. I know. That night, Jacob found himself in the K9 training yard under a sky littered with stars. Ranger sat beside him, ears perked, eyes focused ahead. I think this is where we're supposed to be, buddy, Jacob murmured. Not overseas. Not in combat. Here. Ranger didn't move, but his tail wagged gently. We're going to train new handlers. New dogs. But more than that. Jacob looked toward the horizon. We're going to make sure no one gets left behind again. 3 weeks passed. Jacob found himself settling into a new rhythm, though nothing about it felt like retirement. Each morning began with a jog around the perimeter, Ranger at his side, and each afternoon ended with training sessions for new recruits. Yet in the silence between drills, his thoughts kept circling back to Isabel. To Harold Kane. To Max. And to Ranger's refusal to move that day on the tarmac. It had been instinct, yes. But more than that, it had been memory. One morning, while replacing Ranger's worn tactical vest, Jacob noticed something unusual. The collar, a reinforced nylon piece issued years earlier, had a loose stitch just beneath the main buckle. Barely visible, likely missed during every gear inspection. Out of habit, Jacob tugged at it with his thumb. The thread gave way. Inside, tucked in a narrow seam, was a slip of paper. Jacob's breath hitched. He unfolded it slowly, carefully, like unearthing something ancient and sacred. The edges were frayed, and the ink had faded from moisture and time. But the words were still legible, written in block print, probably from a typewriter. If you found this, then he stayed true. Max was more than a soldier. He was memory. He was guide. And he carried our secret forward, one handler at a time. Jacob read it 3 times before speaking. One handler at a time. It wasn't coincidence. This was design. Ranger hadn't just found Isabel. He had been meant to. Somehow, through a lineage of handlers, dogs, and unspoken traditions, the past had been preserved not in files or archives, but in loyalty. In instinct. In legacy. Later that day, Jacob took a trip to the base archives, a small, dimly lit room beneath the administration wing that smelled of paper and coffee. The archivist, a wiry man named Fenley, squinted when Jacob made his request. Kane. Harold Kane? Jacob nodded. 1953, Operation Ember Dust. Any non-digital logs? Fenley scratched at his beard and disappeared behind the rows of files. 10 minutes later, he returned with a thick manila envelope, tied in twine and marked, K105/classified/obsolete. It's been untouched for decades, Fenley said. No digital copies. These were flagged for destruction 5 years ago, but something put a freeze on the purge. Jacob took the file, heart pounding. Something? Fenley shrugged. Or someone. Back in his quarters, Jacob untied the envelope. Inside were dozens of yellowed pages, mission briefs, field notes, and debriefing transcripts. Most were redacted beyond comprehension. But one page stood out. A personal letter. Handwritten. Signed. To my successor. If you've reached this far, then it means the bond held. Max carried her memory. I believe now that memory can be passed not just through men, but through the dogs we train. He stayed because she needed him. And now, so will you. Keep the legacy. Don't let them erase her. Lieutenant Harold Kane. Jacob leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling. He whispered, "You weren't just remembering her, Ranger, you were protecting her." Ranger, lying beside the desk, gave a short, breathy huff and nudged Jacob's boot. That evening, Jacob made a decision. He retrieved a small weatherproof box and placed several items inside: the original pendant, the blanket, the crayon drawing, the letter from Harold, and the photo of Max. Then he added a new note, written in his own hand. To the next handler who finds this. You're not just inheriting a dog. You're inheriting a promise. He sealed the box, wrapped it in cloth, and left it with Fenley in the archive with strict instructions. Do not catalog this. Do not open it. Just preserve it. Fenley looked confused but nodded. Jacob offered only this: one day, someone will need it more than we do. The next morning, Jacob and Ranger stood on a hill behind the training grounds, overlooking the valley where the old woods met the horizon. The abandoned house was out there somewhere, quiet now. At peace. Still think about her? Jacob asked softly. Ranger didn't respond, but his eyes were trained on the tree line. Jacob smiled. Yeah. Me too. A voice broke the silence. Sergeant Kane. Jacob turned. A young recruit jogged up the hill, panting slightly. Sir, you've been requested in the colonel's office. Something about reassignment options. Jacob glanced down at Ranger. The dog stretched and yawned. Tell him I'll be there in 10. At the colonel's office, Jacob sat straight as the officers slid a file across the desk. We've reviewed your updated report, the colonel said. Unconventional, but compelling. We don't usually entertain narratives involving ghosts or inherited memory, but the Pentagon signed off. Jacob opened the file. It was a special assignment. A new unit. Unofficial. Unlisted. K9 Legacy Project, founded by Kane. Jacob raised an eyebrow. You want us to train dogs, to remember? The colonel chuckled. Not in a supernatural sense, no. But what you did, how your dog led you back to a piece of history no one remembered, that's worth preserving. You'll be off-grid, Kane. Deep rural routes. Supporting child recovery, cold cases, trauma response teams. You'll go where no one else thinks to look. Jacob nodded slowly. Where no one else remembers to look, he said. Exactly. Outside the building, Jacob clipped Ranger's leash back on, though it was more symbolic than anything. You ready to teach others how to listen like you do? Ranger responded with a soft bark, ears high. Jacob smiled. Then let's pass it on. 2 months later, the van pulled to a stop on a dirt road framed by frostbitten pines. Jacob Kane stepped out slowly, boot soles crunching on the thin layer of snow. Ranger leapt down beside him, alert but calm. Both wore plain clothing now, no uniforms, no insignias, just neutral gear built for quiet movement. Their work no longer existed in files. It didn't require clearance or commands. They were part of something quieter. More permanent. The K9 Legacy Project had officially launched 2 weeks earlier. And now, here they were, their first call. A missing child. The report had been vague. An 8-year-old boy named Mason. Vanished from his home sometime in the night. Parents reported a strange barking sound outside before realizing his bed was empty. The local sheriff had no leads. But a former handler in the county, an old friend of Jacob's grandfather, made a call. Not to Central Dispatch, but to the number on the back of the Legacy Project's untraceable card. That's how it always started now. A whisper through the system. A request that couldn't be filed in normal channels. Jacob approached the house, a modest wooden cabin with a porch and a crooked swing. Mason's mother sat on the steps, face hollow, clutching a red ball. Jacob knelt beside her and introduced himself. She didn't look up. He always carried this, she said, holding out the ball. Even in bed. Said it helped him sleep. Jacob took it gently and handed it to Ranger, who sniffed it once, then sat back with his ears perked. The woman looked at the dog. He's different, she said. Jacob nodded. He remembers. Ranger moved first. No leash needed. He trotted down the porch steps, past the broken fence, and into the woods beyond the backyard. Jacob followed without a word. It wasn't a chase. It was a conversation. Between the dog and something older than speech. The trees thickened quickly, snow crunching underfoot. The tracks of the search party had already turned up nothing. But Ranger didn't care about prints. He was following something deeper, memory, emotion, scent braided with fear. They reached a frozen creek. Ranger paused, ears twitching, then turned left along the bank. Jacob stayed close behind. An hour in, Jacob began to worry. The cold was cutting deeper. His radio buzzed with chatter from deputies calling off their sweep. But Ranger pressed on. And then, he stopped. At the edge of a narrow ravine, hidden beneath a sagging pine tree, Ranger crouched low and let out a soft, insistent whine. Jacob stepped forward. There, beneath a camouflage tarp and snow-covered brush, lay a small child's sleeping bag. It moved. Mason? Jacob called gently. The bundle shifted. A pale face peeked out, eyes wide, glassy with exhaustion. "Ranger found me," the boy whispered. Jacob knelt beside him, checking his vitals. Cold, but responsive. "You're safe now," Jacob said, wrapping him in his emergency blanket. "I heard a dog barking last night," Mason murmured. "But not like normal. It sounded like it was calling my name." Jacob glanced at Ranger. "You heard him," he said. Mason nodded. "I followed him here. But then he was gone." Jacob didn't answer. He didn't need to. Somehow, some echo of Ranger had reached the boy before they did, and led him to shelter. Back at the cabin, Mason's parents wept with relief. Ranger sat calmly beside the fireplace, eyes half closed, tail brushing slowly against the rug. Mason wouldn't let go of him. Jacob stood outside, watching snow begin to fall again. The sheriff approached quietly. "That dog saved the kid's life. Hell, he saved our whole department's pride." Jacob smiled faintly. "He's just doing what others forgot to do." The sheriff studied him. "You ever consider going public with this project?" Jacob shook his head. "Some things only work in the quiet." That night, before heading back to base, Jacob left something behind. He walked to the family shed, placed a small, weatherproof container on a rafter beam above the door. Inside was a laminated copy of the drawing Isabel had once made, the girl and the dog. He added a note. "If you ever doubt who called him, just remember, some calls don't come from phones. J.K." Back at Fort Cranston, Jacob filed the report the old-fashioned way, handwritten, sealed, and placed in a secure cabinet beneath the handler's archive. There were no medals. No applause. No press. Just another story for the quiet shelf. The next day, a new recruit arrived. A young woman named Torres. Bright. Observant. With a Malinois pup named Echo that wouldn't stop staring at Ranger. "He watches him like he's telling a story," Torres said. Jacob smiled. "He is." She looked puzzled. "What's he saying?" Jacob turned to her, gaze serious but calm. "He's saying, don't forget." 3 weeks had passed since Mason was found. Winter deepened its grip on the countryside, but the K9 Legacy project didn't slow. If anything, it grew stronger. Whisper by whisper, story by story, families in distant towns started requesting the team no one listed in official databases, a soldier and a dog whose legend traveled without a signal. Jacob found himself in a place he hadn't been since his first days in the army, on edge, but in a good way. Alert. Aware. Fully engaged in every moment. Because every call now came from people forgotten, and every answer came from someone who refused to forget. That morning, a letter arrived. Not digital. Not even typed. A hand-addressed envelope in charcoal ink, sealed with wax. Inside, a single folded page. "My daughter used to talk to the walls. We thought she had an imaginary friend. Now I'm not so sure. Please come." It was unsigned, except for a location, Blue Hollow Road. Rural District 17. Jacob traced his finger over the address. Ranger sat at his feet, ears perked. "You feel it too?" Jacob asked. The dog stood immediately. Blue Hollow wasn't on most maps. It was the kind of place where streetlights stopped showing up after sunset and mailboxes leaned like they'd been tired for years. The house was set deep in the woods, a long-abandoned mining cabin converted to a residence. The yard was littered with rusting tools and a broken swing swaying in the cold wind. Jacob parked and approached the house slowly. Ranger moved ahead, nose twitching. The door creaked open before Jacob knocked. A pale man, late 50s, peered out with sunken eyes. "She hasn't spoken in 2 days," he said. Jacob stepped inside. The air was heavy, like a place holding its breath. The girl, maybe 6 or 7, sat in a corner of the living room. She didn't look up. Just kept whispering into the old wall, a wall stained by time and stories no one had ever written down. Ranger didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply sat in front of her and waited. The girl stopped whispering and looked up. Her eyes filled with tears. "You heard her too," she said. Jacob's blood ran cold. "Who?" he asked gently. "The girl in the wall. She said she was waiting for Max." Jacob sat down slowly beside Ranger. "What did she say exactly?" The girl placed her hand on Ranger's head. "She said she saw the soldier's dog again. She said," the collar was still listening. That night, after hours of sitting with the girl and listening to stories that made no rational sense but every emotional one, Jacob examined Ranger's collar again. The hidden pocket where he'd once found the typed message had been sewn shut. But this time, he noticed another seam. Finer. Hidden deeper in the fabric. He unstitched it slowly. Inside was a second slip of paper. This one handwritten. "He may not bark. He may not run. But he remembers everyone. When you're alone, just speak aloud. The dog will hear you, even in a crowd." Jacob stared at the note for a long time. Ranger sat quietly, tail thumping once. "You're more than memory," Jacob whispered. "You're a messenger." Over the next week, the little girl began speaking again. Her words were simple, but specific. Names of people no longer living. Places Jacob had never mentioned. Details that would have no place in a child's imagination, unless she was being told them. Ranger became her shadow. Her comfort. Her guide. One night, she turned to Jacob while tracing shapes on the frosted window. "She says the dog brought you too." Jacob nodded. "She's right." As they prepared to leave, the girl handed Jacob something. A pebble. Painted white. A red dot in the center. She said it's from the river under the house, where Max used to play. Jacob pocketed it without question. Some tokens weren't meant to be understood. Only carried forward. Back at Fort Cranston, another letter arrived, this time in a child's handwriting. "Thank you for bringing the quiet dog. He makes the walls less scary. Lila." Attached was a drawing. The girl. And Ranger. And a shadow in the shape of Max, resting behind them both. Jacob placed the pebble, the note, and the drawing into a new container. Another box for the archive. Another story remembered. That evening, he stood in front of a class of new recruits. On the table sat Echo, Torres's Malinois pup, along with 3 other young dogs, each one alert, smart, and still learning how to trust. "You're not just handlers," Jacob told them. "You're caretakers of memory." One recruit scoffed. "Sir, we're training dogs, not historians." Jacob smiled faintly. "You're wrong. History forgets. These dogs don't." He tossed a tennis ball toward Ranger, who caught it mid-air without flinching. "Listen to them long enough," Jacob said, "and they'll tell you what you've been missing." That night, while walking the perimeter, Jacob paused beneath the flagpole. The stars above were sharp. The wind was still. He reached down and tapped Ranger's collar, now repaired and slightly worn. "If you can carry all of them," he said softly, "I can carry you." Ranger nudged his hand. And for a moment, Jacob heard something, not in words, but in presence. A feeling. As if someone, somewhere, had whispered. "He's still listening." It was almost midnight when Jacob received the last call of the night. Not through any phone. Not from the base. It came as a knock on the old wooden door of his barracks, soft, hesitant, and patient. Ranger stirred but didn't bark. He simply rose to his feet and walked to the door, sitting beside it. Jacob opened it slowly. Outside stood a boy. Maybe 9 or 10. Freckles. Nervous hands. Behind him was a woman, tired eyes, red coat, no umbrella. "I'm sorry," she said. "They said you might understand." Jacob stepped aside and let them in. Over tea, the woman explained. Her son, Ethan, had stopped speaking after a fire at their home nearly a year ago. No medical condition. No injuries. Just silence. Months of it. Every therapist failed. Every doctor shrugged. "Sometimes," she said, "he taps things. Once, he tapped our family dog's collar 3 times and just sat there, like he was waiting for someone else." Jacob glanced at Ethan. The boy had his hand on Ranger's collar now. Tapping gently. 3 times. Ranger didn't move. But his ears twitched. Ethan looked up. Into Ranger's eyes. And whispered, just once. "Max?" Jacob's hand froze midair. The boy nodded again. Then turned to Jacob and said, with tears in his eyes. "He said you'd know what to do." Later, as the boy slept curled against Ranger in the corner of the barracks room, the woman quietly asked, "What is this? What's happening?" Jacob didn't try to explain memory. Or trauma. Or the unseen bonds between past and present. He simply said, "Some dogs don't forget. Some dogs carry more than scent." The woman looked down at Ranger. "And you?" "I listen," Jacob said. "Because the ones before me didn't." By morning, Ethan had drawn a picture. Not of Ranger. Not of Jacob. But of a house, the same house where Isabel had once lived. The same white bear on the porch swing. And a soldier kneeling with a dog at his side. Below it, the caption in blocky handwriting. "He came back." Weeks passed. Then months. The K9 Legacy Project expanded quietly. Not with press. Not with medals. But with stories tucked into boxes, whispered between walls, and drawn in crayon on the backs of postcards. Jacob became not just a soldier, but a listener. The dogs, more than partners, became keepers. Every collar reinforced. Every one with a hidden pocket stitched with care. Every one holding a message, for the next lost voice, the next child with something to whisper. One day, Jacob found a package in his mailbox. No return label. Inside, a collar. Old. Torn. But familiar. Carved into the leather, faded, nearly worn smooth, was a name. Max. And inside the hidden seam? A message burned in small letters onto cloth. "Thank you for listening. He stayed because you came." Jacob clutched the collar to his chest. He didn't cry. But Ranger pressed his head against Jacob's knee, as if to say, "I heard it too." In time, Ranger grew slower. His pace mellowed. His eyes dulled with age, but never in presence. His ears still perked whenever a child entered the room. He still rested near doors where secrets waited. On his final night, Jacob laid beside him on the floor. Ranger didn't whine. He didn't struggle. He just rested his head against Jacob's chest, a soldier's goodbye without a sound. As dawn touched the window, Ranger exhaled once. And was gone. The base held no ceremony. But later that day, every legacy handler across the country received a message. Short. No explanation. Just this. He stayed. Jacob buried Ranger beneath a tree outside the training yard, beside a stone that read simply, "Loyal to the last whisper." And on the tree above it, carved carefully by hand, "Max Ranger. All who remember." Years passed. New recruits came and went. But the dogs? They never forgot. One evening, a little girl tapped a young canine's collar twice and whispered, "Isabel?" And the dog turned sharply toward a wall no one had noticed in years. That's how Jacob knew. The legacy was alive. It always would be. Because some collars don't just hold identification tags. They hold stories. They hold promises. And most of all, they hold memory.